Hi, it's Jerry Vera Jr. here, Mafia Seat of Power if you're following us. We've been talking about the Mulberry Street Crew, and again, I'm not going to get into details because I do plan on having another book written, or a documentary, a movie, or something like that. I was explaining how the crews are different from the families, and they're untouchable because the bosses are afraid of them, because these are drug traffickers, man. These guys are hardcore. These are blowing up cars with families in it like the Colombians did. That's what you're dealing with here. There wasn't the same code that the Mafia had, with no women and children. That eventually went to hell, but they didn't have those codes. They were, believe me, they were afraid of these guys. Now, I mentioned briefly how after Valachi's testimony, it was easier for FBI guys to find out who's a member of this family and whatnot, and the crews stood under the radar because they weren't made. They weren't on any list. They were zips, as they were referred to, at least some of them. Well, some inaccuracies that I know of just off the bat, from Joe Valachi, for example. You talk to some of the old-timers back then, which I've talked to a lot of us. Valachi was full of shit. He didn't know nothing, okay? Well, there's a couple of things that I know. For example, a guy named Joseph Tedeschi, T-E-D-E-S-C-H-I, Jojo Crump. He was a player back then in the Genovese family, never listed, okay? Vincenzo Altamare, Jimmy Alto, up until recent, never listed. They didn't know about these guys. They didn't know, and I'll give you another mistake. Sally Burns, or Salvatore Granello was his real name. The people close to him knew him as Sally Burns. He was listed as a soldier on the Lucchese chart family. He was never a Lucchese, Sally Burns. He was a Genovese, okay? And he was high up, too. He had an apartment on Mott Street. I forgot where it was, 126 or something. Funny story, he took two apartments, knocked out the wall to make it one big apartment. Well, what happened was, these guys didn't know what load-bearing walls were, so the ceiling started to sink. And they didn't know what the hell was going on. So they had an engineer come in when they figured it out, and they put a couple of pillars in there to hold it up, you know, because you need the header there. There's got to be a header. There's got to be something. So it's kind of a funny thing. I wonder whatever happened if they reverted it or if somebody's living in some big apartment. But Sally Burns grew up on Mott Street. I'm not going to get into how well he was liked or not liked, but he grew up with my Uncle Paulie on Mott Street, and my family knew him well. I'll talk a little bit more about him in the next video and tell you about Greenwood Lake and some other areas that most people never heard of. So we'll get into a little bit of that. Some people will know what it is. I think the first time it was ever mentioned was in Mean Streets, the movie, but I don't think it was written about in any book other than our book, for members only. I don't remember reading about Greenwood Lake anywhere else, but we'll talk a little bit about that in the next video.